we're going to talk about guard retention now. Guard retention is where we retain guard.
Yeah.
This is a big deal. As a beginner in jiu-jitsu, this is going to be something that, depending on where you train, you may get very little or even no training on this. It's just something that you're supposed to get good at some point. Although luckily, over the last, let's say, year or two, a lot more attention is being paid to this in general in the community. So there's some excellent instructionals that you can get that will help you learn this. We just want to give you an overview of what this stuff sort of looks like.
So when we're talking about retaining guard, we're talking about being in the defensive loop or cycle or defensive movements, however you want to define it. So you have to be very, very proactive in the sense of making sure that you're keeping yourself in alignment, managing the distance best you can, but understanding as well that there's going to be a lot of reactionary movements here. And so we got, like, when we start getting into sweeps and stuff, we'll show you guys how you can actually start to transition into turning into offensive movements where you're going to be able to actually start attacking. But right now, Rob's going to keep himself in good alignment, using frames to manage the distance, depending on the guard that he's using. But usually within like guard retention, if we're talking about trying to drill and spar this specifically, you're actually going to be playing more of an open style and not trying to control your opponent.
So let's talk specifically about retention versus recovery, because that's an important distinction. It's honestly not a very important distinction for, let's say, the vast majority of you who are not going to compete. But for those that are interested in competing and those that are just interested in being a little bit more knowledgeable, retention is when I'm keeping somebody like in front of me with my guard and not letting him get to a passing position. Whereas recovery is where somebody's almost gotten past my guard and I have to get my guard back at that point. The distinction between the two is one that can score points or advantages in competition. If somebody gets past my legs and settles the position, they have passed my guard. They will earn usually 3 points depending on the rule set. But if they just kind of get to here momentarily and I manage to get my guard back, they will still score what's called an advantage, which if you're not sure what that is, it's kind of like getting a half point for hitting the rim in basketball, which doesn't exist, which goes to show you how stupid they are. But anyway, that's another story. So yeah, the important distinction between retention and recovery. Retention assumes that I'm still, let's say, doing fine. Like I don't have any real problems if I'm just doing guard retention. If you never get outside of what we like to call headlights, which is something we stole from Jason Scully, who runs Grappler's Guide, which is an awesome resource. Headlights is if you were to just draw a line throughout, like from your hips, out your knees, out your legs. As long as Rory is...
So Rob's on his back here. You can see how, by the position of his legs, even if he extended his legs out quite far here, I am in the headlights of his legs here. There's a leg on either side, so especially if we go, like, say, just feet on the hips, if I move around to my right, Rob's left, he tracks me. And if I move to my left, his right, he tracks me. If he has both his legs on one side of my center line, well, we can see that there's not really much of a guard. If I was an idiot and drove into legs here, great. But I'm going to be going around this direction where his legs aren't able to stop me, where he's not using his legs properly, his frames to block like the leading edge of my body that's moving around to pin him. And it's going to be very easy. And that's going to be my goal as the passer, is to try and redirect the legs off to the side as one of the methods to try and pass guard here.
Yeah, so as long as I'm able to keep Rory within my headlights, and while I've got him within my headlights, as long as I've got frames on him that prevent him from coming forward. Because for instance, like Rory could be in my headlights, but if he pins one of my legs, this is no that's not great. So it's not as simple as just keep someone in your headlights.
We're talking about hip positioning in that instance, where you're keeping your hips facing your opponent, so you have all your weapons, your limbs facing them.
Yeah, so that's kind of the first thing, is I want somebody in front of my hips, in front of my frames, and then I want as many frames as possible throughout the process. So like, if I've got 1 foot on Rory right now, this is not great. If he gets rid of it, he's immediately able to get to my hips. If I've got 2 feet on Rory, that's better, but there's still things he can do. If he gets rid of this one, and then starts to knee cut maybe, or leg drag or whatever, he's gonna be able to get directly to a passing position. So if I now have a frame over here, if I've got a frame over here, now if he goes to move, if he goes to do anything, it becomes really difficult for him to get anywhere. If he gets past one of my frames, I've still got 3 left. If he gets past 2 of my frames, I've still got 1 left, etc., etc. So when we're talking about guard retention, we want as much redundancy built into the system as possible. Yes, there are some people who are highly flexible or very good at the recovery part, getting back to guard, and they still make it work, but unless you're very athletic, very flexible, et cetera, not something you want to rely on. You want to have as many frames in the way. And then when we get into the guard retention movements, which we'll teach them specifically, or at least it's the couple best ones that you want to rely on, you want to have multiple layers of frames, and then you want to have multiple movements that you can go to depending on the situation to keep the other person in front of you or to get your hips back in front of them.
Yeah, and so when we keep talking about your alignment that you're wanting within guard retention, knee-elbow connection is super important. As the passer, my goal is to beat the legs, control the hips, and specifically control the space between the hips and the armpits. So as we talked
When
about,
we say knee-elbow connection, we
Bible.
don't literally mean like take your elbow and put it on top of your kneecap. What we mean is there's an unbroken wall keeping Rory out of this space.
If I can occupy the space like side control, Rob tries to close that knee elbow connection. I have blocked it. I have really strong rotational control. If Rob kept this knee elbow connection and I try to drop into that space right now, it's very difficult. Now, if Rob completely gives that knee elbow connection on this side, I'm going to be able to make good things happen. So it's going to be on Rob to try to do the best that he can. Certain movements will create certain vulnerabilities, but if Rob can keep knee elbow connection on both sides, you can see how there's just a strong position that I just kind of, the scaffolding that I'll just end up resting on top of. And while I'm still winning a certain range battle, I'm keeping Rob defensive, there's still a lot of options that Rob has rather than me being able to control the inside space.
And it's important to note, since we were talking about headlights earlier, Rory is still in my headlights. It might not seem like it because normally if I was playing guard, I'd prefer to have Rory in front of me. But Rory being beside me, as long as I maintain this structure,
Hips are still facing me.
My hips are still facing him. He's not able to occupy the space between my hip and my armpit. And I've got a series of frames. So I've got my shin, I've got my forearm, I've got my shin, I've got my forearm. Rory is past my feet. So this would be my longest range frames. But he's not past and he's past, let's say most of my shin, but he's not past my knees yet, he's not past my elbows. I'm very safe here. Right? I'm not necessarily offensively a threat, but I'm quite safe. And as long as you recognize what the guard is meant to be first, which is a defensive tool, a range management tool, something that keeps you safe, whether it's from a jiu-jitsu perspective, purely no strikes, not letting someone get to a dominant position so they can submit you, or from a self-defense, MMA context, not getting knocked out with strikes because you're able to keep somebody at a distance. Either way, it's first primarily a defensive tool. Then it becomes offensive if you're good enough at keeping somebody in your guard and off-balancing them, as we talked about with some of the goals on bottom. Primarily Kuzushi are off-balancing to get somebody into a vulnerable position. So once you achieve this parameter of keeping somebody in front of you, or in front of your defensive tools, then you can employ your offensive tools.
Yeah, and so like Rob said, it's not necessarily having that direct connection of your elbow to your knee. There'll be times where you actually will be extending your arms out and it'll be just contact to the inside or the outside or even a little bit of space created, but the most important thing is that we're minimizing that. When we kind of went to that half guard situation or with the shin across, Rob here is connecting out towards my bicep. You can see how he's still trying to maintain that knee elbow connection the best he can. As this arm comes across here, there might be a tiny little bit of space there for a moment. That's okay. As long as he's not opening this up or going into a hip escape that he holds for a long period of time, then this is obviously going to create vulnerability. Rob might choose to have complete knee elbow connection, which is going to be the most secure, but if there's a slight little gap at certain points when he's performing movements, it's always going to be there's a timing thing, there's human error that can be taken advantage of. We're just trying to minimize that as much as possible.
Yeah, the important thing, the overarching thing is that we know that we need to have layers of frames. Anytime a frame is removed, we want to replace it as soon as possible. And we want to keep somebody out of this space. If someone starts to get into this space, we need to keep them in place so that we can move away. And that's what all of the guard retention and recovery movements are going to be based around.
And so when we're looking at posture, when we're looking at knee-elbow connection, it usually ties in quite well that we don't usually want to have an actual straight back, and we don't want our head just laying lazily on the floor. So what I'm actually looking at doing is creating a slight concave to my spine here as I'm just performing a bit of a crunch to kind of lift my shoulders and my head off the mat. This is going to make it easier to bring my elbows down to my knees as I bring my knees up to my elbows, and I lift my tailbone slightly off the mat here. I'm reducing my surface area, which is going to make it easier for me to be more mobile. If I'm just completely flat like this, one, my knee-elbow connection will probably be shittier. And then when Rob starts to move me, it's harder for me to be mobile. Now, it seems counterintuitive that I want to be more mobile in the sense that with less contact to the ground, it's going to make it easier for you to move me.
Yeah.
But because I have less contact with the mat, it's also easier for me to be following you. And when Rob starts looking at redirecting me and stuff, my hips are already engaged. I'm able to start to be very mobile just off my back, because my back's my base here, which is obviously going to be when Rob drives down into me like in a leg press fashion, I'm braced against the mat. But I also need to be able to generate base off of Rob so that I can start to pivot. So you can see here, I'm using Rob as base so that I can actually start to move myself. And if Rob started to move around to my side here, just with my hand, even without contact here, I'm able to use that as base to see how I can start to mobilize my hips. And so by reducing my contact with the ground, I can start to spin faster like a top, back and forth, to change the angles I need to make sure that my hips stay facing Rob, and I'm able to use my frames effectively.
Yeah, and there will be exceptions to that. For example, if you go double unders, so this is a type of pass that I'm gonna want to like make my body really heavy and plank out so that Rory can't lift my legs and throw them by, right? So we're not saying, always, but as a general rule, you're gonna want to be fairly curled up, knees to your chest, and you're gonna want to either eliminate or at the very least minimize the amount of times that you do this, because your knee is coming away from your chest, which is creating the space that you're trying to hide from your opponent. So
in the next video, we're going to actually get specifically into some guard retention techniques. The high leg, or also known as the high pummel, is the staple of guard retention.
It's also called a crossover sometimes. There's a few different names for it. And as far as overarching concepts, you mentioned it briefly, but I think it's probably good if we just spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of the leading edge of the body. The formula that we use for guard retention is block the leading edge, mobilize the hips, and then recompose your hip angle. The leading edge of the body is whatever part of the body is going to pin you or is leading the way with pressure when somebody attempts a guard pass. If Rory is on his knees, most of the time the leading edge will be his shoulder. If Rory is on his feet, most of the time the leading edge will be his inside shin, although occasionally it'll be his outside shin. That doesn't mean always. Again, it's just the majority of the time in those situations, that will be the leading edge.
And it's almost never the hip.
Exactly. So as far as, again, what you may or may not be taught, blocking the hip as a guard retention maneuver is it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not wrong. There are times when it's appropriate, particularly in guard recovery, and particularly like if I'm at range, this is totally fine. But if somebody has beat my guard, putting my knee down and blocking the hip so that I can hip escape is not very useful. Not only that, and this is a safety thing that I take everybody through, if I make this shape where Rory's hip is at the end of my hand, like where my fingers start, at the end of the palm of my hand, what I've effectively done is created a lever and put most of Rory's center of gravity over top of it. If he were to cut his hips and my elbow were to hit the ground, my wrist is now trapped, and I have seen people explode their wrists from this. This is something I warn everybody when they're rolling to never do. This is not a shape that you want to make with all the weight at the end here. It's not wrong to do it with the heel of my palm. If I have the heel of my palm here, if he turns his hips, the worst that'll happen is my hand will slip. It's not wrong to do it with the web of your hand. Again, if he turns his hips, my hand will just slip through. That's fine. So if you have to frame the hip, first of all, it's usually better to do it with your elbow. But if you have to frame the hip, just please don't stick the palm of your hand underneath someone's hip. That's a generally terrible idea. It doesn't lead to anything other than hospital visits. So avoid that if possible. But again, the leading edge will usually be, the top of the shin or the knee, or the sort of chest, shoulder area. Occasionally it'll be the ribs. It'll be the hip once in a while, so we're not saying never. But the trick in getting good at guard retention is, and guard recovery in particular as well, because guard retention is really more just about keeping Rory in front of me. As long as I just kind of stay here and just highlight, if he redirects me, I'm keeping my feet in front of him. So I don't have to be as, let's say, precise about the leading edge, because Rory is so far away that there could be multiple leading edges, and as long as I have multiple layers of frames, I'm okay. It's when he starts to get past my legs. There's the leading edge. That's when recognizing precisely what the leading edge is becomes very important, and that takes the longest amount of time in training, just the amount of mat time to know, okay, that's the leading edge, okay, that's the leading edge. Until you know specifically, if you guess wrong, you get your guard passed.
Yeah, it takes some time.
Yeah.
So enough of these broad overviews of
Yes.
subjects. We're going to get into the actual techniques now. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the high leg or the high pommel in guard retention.